Thank you so much. First, I'd like to thank Stephanie, Trisha Rose, and the CSREA for the invitation to moderate this event, especially since it is with Professor Mireya Loza, a historian, a scholar, a person that I have so much admiration for, and who over the years has been very generous to not only me, but also so many other junior scholars in providing guidance and support to. So I'm very thrilled and honored to join you all today for this conversation. A little bit about the format of this event. I'll be introducing Professor Mireya Loza, who will then give a presentation for about a half an hour, and then we will then open it up to the audience for questions and comments for roughly about 25 minutes or so. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mireya Loza, who is an alumni of the Public Humanities and American Studies MA and PhD programs here at Brown University. Professor Loza is an associate professor in the Department of History and American Studies program at Georgetown University. Her areas of research include Latinx history, social movements, labor history, and food studies. Her first book, Defiant Braceros, How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, it examines the Bracero Program and how guest workers negotiated the intricacies of indigeneity, intimacy, and transnational organizing. Defiant Braceros won the 2017 Theodore Saluto's Book Prize, awarded by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, as well as the Smithsonian Secretary's Research Prize. Professor Loza is currently carrying out research for her second book project, tentatively entitled The Strangeness and Bitterness of Plenty, Making Food and Seeing Race in the Agricultural West. Her research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the Mexico North Research Network, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and she was also named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown, Professor Loza was a curator at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History and was an assistant professor in food studies at New York University. So without further ado, I'm delighted to now turn over the event to Professor Loza, who will be imparting some knowledge and sharing with us her important research. So Professor Loza.
Share my screen. Here we go. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. Ocegueda has been a longtime friend, and it is going to be a fun time today. I'd also like to thank Stephanie LaRue, who I've also known for a long time. I am a graduate of American Studies at Brown, so I'm really excited to be back in this community and engage in ideas and basically scholarship. So my book, Defiant Braceros, How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, grew out of my participation in the Bracero History Project. The Bracero History Project was an amazing project that basically found a home in several institutions, and one being Brown. Amazing people from Brown, from George Mason Center for the Study of History and New Media, from the National Museum of American History, and from UTEP's Institute of Oral History came together to really conceptualize a large, transnational, gigantic project to collect and digitize documents and collect oral histories and digitized documents of Bracero communities. So to start off with, let's talk about what the Bracero Program is. So the Bracero Program is a binational agreement between Mexico and the US, which allowed Mexican male laborers to enter the US on temporary work permits from 1942 to 64. The US needed laborers due to a perceived labor shortage, and perception here is everything. It lasted much longer than basically this war period because there was a shift in our basically value of this work. And so Braceros worked in agriculture and railroad, and the railroad component ended shortly after the war ended, partly because railroad jobs are good jobs, and the railroad union was a strong union. And so people could see upward mobility for their families through these railroad jobs. So the bigger question is, why did we continue to rely on these men for agriculture? Over 4.5 million contracts were issued. So it wasn't 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 men. This really shaped Mexican migration from the US or from Mexico to the US. This is really a dramatic immigration moment. So as I documented more and more of these stories, because I myself, as a graduate student at Brown working on this project, was basically told to help not only build this archive, but to go across the US and identify communities that basically should be studied and oral histories that should be collected for this period in time. And what became really clear to me is that I really was more interested in what the figure of the guest worker meant in America and public memory around migration, and overall why we tell the stories we tell. I'm an American studies person, and so the numbers, the statistics and the places, they're important. But for me, it was also important to ask, why are we telling this story? Why is the National Museum really interested in this? Why is the federal government and officials, why are they thinking about Braceros as an immigration solution? Why are we talking about this right now? So as I traveled across the US and documented and worked with communities to save these oral histories and to really talk about this moment in migration history, I found myself drawn to boundaries of the scholarship on these guest workers. I thought about the gaps in the scholarship. I basically digitized documents for the archive and identified objects for the museum, for the National Museum of American History. And my eye really honed in on people that I really thought were difficult to basically commemorate in the National Museum's halls. People that really didn't embody the types of respectability that could be easily commemorated and easily used to celebrate this experience. My book, Defiant Braceros, focuses on subjects either termed deviant or defiant in the ways they reject both US and Mexican projects that attempt to create a masculine mestizo respectability rooted in idealized discourses of family and labor. I look at the way these men engage in illicit or unsanctioned acts in order to reclaim their bodies and their political voice. I'm going to walk you through a couple of case studies, but before that, I'm going to basically show you what was the kind of beating heart of this public history project, which were these photographs that came to the National Museum of American History that were donated by, or they were purchased by the museum from the Leonard Nadel family. And so Leonard Nadel traveled across the US and Mexico documenting Bracero experiences in the 1950s. And the museum was really interested in collecting this as a cornerstone of this project. So these are pictures from the mid-1950s. And as you see, this is a lot. These are a lot of people. This isn't, again, 1, 2, 3 people. These are many people outside of a contracting center on the border. Leonard Nadel was really interested in also documenting the scale and the scope of this program. So what would happen if you were basically recruited in the first years of this program? You'd go to Mexico City, and that's where the contracting center was. And you maybe weren't so sure about what was happening, but by the mid-1950s, returning braceros had told stories about the money that they made, about the arduous labor, about the process. And so people were excited about a work opportunity, and many were apprehensive about what this work opportunity would mean. You'd maybe borrow money from family, friends to get this far. You might also travel with people from your hometown community. And you'd carry everything on you. As you can see here, people basically had makeshift bags, small items. They didn't know how long they'd be waiting for their name to be called at these processing centers. And so you could wait a week, you could wait 3 months, and these sites were not meant to hold people for that long. And so they were very chaotic. And again, Leonard Nadel, the photographer, was very interested in capturing the scale and the scope. So if you were lucky enough to be called, the first thing that they check was your hands. Your hands are sort of like your CV. You want to show that you have calluses on your hands and that you are in fact an agricultural worker. If you were a baker, if you were a tailor, people could look at you suspect. And so bakers, tailors, folks that were professionals, they would beat their hands against rocks while they were waiting for their names to be called so that they could begin to develop these calluses. And they play the role of basically an agricultural worker. If you were lucky enough and you'd go on to the next step, you would dictate your name, all of your information to a typist. Mexican-American women were really fundamental in this process as they found employment in these centers because of their bilingual skills. And then the most jarring parts would happen, which is you're being hired as an able-bodied worker, and they want to make sure that that is exactly what you are, that you're in top physical condition. Home or host communities would often be wary that these men would be carrying diseases, illnesses. And so it was essential that these men basically were not only in their best health, but also demonstrated that their bodies were capable of carrying out this physical labor. So this is a doctor holding a flashlight to the mouths of these men. They'd also take x-rays to make sure that you did not have tuberculosis or any illnesses that they perceived were dangerous to these host communities. And there's an entire body of how medical discourses collide with race and how communities of color are often seen suspect and as carriers of these diseases, all perception. And then lastly, if you were lucky enough to clinch this contract, you'd be sprayed with DDT, which is a toxic insecticide that was commonly used in the 1940s and 50s on fields, in 60s in fields, and also as a tool of immigration. And so each and every time they passed the border, they were sprayed with this. The idea was that it would kill lice or any other things that folks could be carrying. So what was the Bracero History Project? The Bracero History Project was basically a project that would collect the oral histories and the objects to build a national collection, but also build an archive. You can hear the stories and see the digitized documents on braceroarchive.org, and also fundamentally teach this public history. So the project also created a traveling exhibition called Bittersweet Harvest, which traveled from 2009 up until last year. So it was like the little engine that could. Oftentimes people think that Latinx communities really aren't interested in going to museums or engaging in public history projects. And this really taught a big lesson that Latino communities are really interested when the topics speak to them. So this is a picture of Bittersweet Harvest. It was really these lightweight panels, in part to make the travel costs really accessible for community centers and museums across the US. It was very popular for a traveling exhibition. Over 10 years travel is a phenomenal win. And the objects did not travel. So host communities were encouraged to pull out their own objects and to basically rescue and preserve local community history alongside and showcase it with the exhibition. And then lastly, the Bracero History Archive. It was the 2010 winner of the National Council Prize in Public History. I know it looks a little old school, but you have to remember 2010, this was all the rage. Omeka basically cut its teeth on this project. And so you may think like, meh, not so wow. But in 2010, it was more than wow. In 2005 and 6, when this was made available, well, 6 when this was made available to the public, it made a really big splash. So I will walk you through now a couple of the case studies that really drive my research. This itself was an opportunity for me to hear a lot of stories of people, like I said, across the US and Mexico, but I really wanted to understand what was going on beyond these stories. And I wanted to understand what was going to happen to the stories that weren't going to be told at the National Museum, stories that people didn't applaud about, people didn't really know about. And so I'm going to walk you through 3 case studies that spring directly from my basically work in public history. While I consulted libraries, archives for my research, I also helped set up collecting sites. Working with the public shaped every aspect of my scholarship. For example, my first chapter stems from an experience in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was one of the most difficult collecting sites because many of the men encountered problems traveling from their homes to the congested filled downtown. In a last minute effort to get closer to these men, I contacted activists at La Casa del Mexicano in Boyle Heights, and they basically welcomed us. And so we packed up half of the team and headed out to Boyle Heights. And there I met Nemesio Mesa. La Casa hosted several activists and really hosted a lot of activity around the Bracero justice movement, which I will talk more about. These activists had direct connections to the local community and really connected us in profound ways. And there in a quiet room with a basic table and 2 chairs and a broken glass window, the interview began in the ordinary manner in which extraordinary stories are told. I asked questions from an oral history guide, and Nemesio graciously answered with detail. But then, about 45 minutes into the interview, he mentioned something that wasn't included in our guide, even though for him it was the greatest challenge he faced during the Bracero program. It was language. He was an indigenous Nahuatl speaker from Puebla, and he had not been speaking Spanish for very long before he received his contract. And I was dumbfounded at the obvious shortcoming of our guide, and I quickly realized that they failed to encompass Nemesio's experience. At that point, I revised my call and basically asked indigenous families to step forward. Indigenous families step forward in small towns in Southern California, but I knew we really needed to make an effort to go to Mexico and find these participants that had an important story to tell and to help us complete this picture of the Bracero experience. So in the summer of 2008, I embarked on a collection trip organized by activists in the Bracero justice movement that would take me across Mexico, equipped with a backpack containing a scanner, a recorder, a computer. I began in Monterrey and followed organizers all the way to the south of Mexico. And in Canzacab, Yucatan, I met Julio Valentin Maimai. Let me show you a picture of him. And there, Julio Valentin Maimai graciously agreed to help me. In Canzacab, Yucatan, he basically offered assistance and connected me to a whole indigenous community there, his community. And he said to me, yo era indígena. I was indigenous. The word era, meaning was, rang over and over in my mind, even after our interview concluded. Coming from a really different experience, I couldn't imagine telling anyone I was Latina. It just didn't fit in my scope of racial and ethnic identification. So I couldn't really understand what he meant. What was it about his experience in the Bracero program that moved him away from indigeneity? Was indigeneity a fluid racial and ethnic characteristic that could be changed? I listened for more answers to these questions as other indigenous Braceros spoke about their experience and said things that shocked me, like me modernicé, I became modern, me civilicé, I became civilized. I thought about this because I wondered why they'd use these terms to really characterize their experience. And as I interviewed more and more indigenous Braceros, I understood that this was really about critiquing Mexican and talking about Mexican modernity and mestizaje, the historical mixing of Spanish and indigenous people. And some people outright critiqued it by saying, why would I say I'm mestizo or Spanish if I'm indigenous? And so there were folks that corroborated it and folks that outright rejected this project. So why is it important? Why are these questions important? Scholars have explored the racism embedded in the discourses of Mexican government officials as they envision guest workers to be racially and ethnically inferior and undesirable members of the nation, the most needed of modernization. And this is how they saw them. This is Hoy magazine, which circulated in Mexico City. As you can tell, the little indigenous boy at the center is kind of left in the middle of a charro. And you know he's a charro by the big bow tie and, you know, a emblem of mestizaje, right? And what I imagine is a Texas cowboy. And there he stands in the middle. as he's about to be almost eaten by these people whose like teeth just jet out, kind of hungry for him. And you know he's indigenous because of his pantalones de manta and all of these symbols of indigeneity, like his sarape, and it says campesino. They constructed, the folks that put out this magazine, the indigenous subject as really a child and in need of kind of this guidance or this moment of something between these adults, right? Of course, this racism is based on histories of colonization, the oppression of indigenous communities, and nation building strategies that focused on the mestizo as the ideal citizen for an emerging modern Mexico. And, you know, the truth is that growers also knew this too. So this is a feature in Agriculture Life magazine. And here you're supposed to be able to tell who the returning bracero is and who the first time bracero is. And the first time bracero is the bracero with sandals, another symbol of indigeneity and a campesino identity. If the mestizo rural peasantry was marginalized because of its indigenous heritage, where would that leave populations who identified only as indigenous and who did not have claims on whiteness or mestizaje? As historian Robert Bluffington cleanly observes, in modern Mexico, Indians, quote, Indians would learn to be productive citizens or be damned. That is to say, there was no place for a modern indigenous future during this period. The Bracero Program was a way for indigenous people then to become productive citizens by learning to labor in the US. Their bodies would be disciplined abroad and ready for reintegration upon their return to Mexico. Experts thought that our populations would learn new measures of productivity based on scales of precise time, distance, weight. Mestizaje could be mediated and consolidated on US soil at the hands of growers. This would mean indigenous populations could learn to be better Mexicans abroad. But what would this mean to basically the Mexican family and the social fabric and effectual bonds that held communities together? My second case study basically builds on these ideas and critically examines the social construction of the Mexican family and the naturalization of these social relationships and their deployment in the logics of behind joining the Bracero Program. Narratives that characterize braceros as good fathers, brothers, husbands who worked abroad and sacrificed, piously basically saving their money and sending remittances became the central logics for explaining why anyone would endure this exploitation. That is to say, a good father would go, he would face the DDT sprains, he would face the humiliation in order to have economic family advancement. I unravel these narratives basically to think about men who fall out of this schema, men who were adventurous, unmarried. And what was surely an unintended consequence of the Bracero Program, it really ended up expanding social relationships and the practices of sexuality that in some instances redefine notions of gender, family, and masculinity. Family units became rearranged as braceros built new community networks in a predominantly homosocial space in the US. Labor camps became spaces where braceros could enjoy vices, solicit sex workers, gamble, and drink away from the watchful eyes of family and friends who could call attention to this behavior. It's not that this didn't happen in Mexico. It's that the labor camp is a different kind of space where a lot of social norms are suspended because it is predominantly a male space. These practices took on new meanings as braceros reclaimed their bodies used for disciplined labor production and reconditioned them to also engage in pleasure, even if it was just temporary. Experiences of laboring in the United States went beyond shaping race and ethnicity, but they also became fertile grounds for sexual and intimate, basically practices structured by the transnational nature of the program. Engaging in the illicit economies of sex work was not the only option men had for intimacy. Bracero Gustavo Rodriguez openly shared stories of queer encounters. As a Oaxacan bracero, he received his first contract to work in Blythe, California. And in his words, and I quote, he said, "Look, in the 1960s, when I was in Blythe, in that time you heard very little about those people. But before, you could see a couple of those people in the camps. And in the barracks where I slept, there was a kid. He was also in the same barracks. He slept at the entrance of the barrack. One night, the light was cut off, but I didn't know why. There was a whole discussion and argument amongst those by the door. And the next day, they clarified why it happened. That kid was named Porfirio. He was from the state of Oaxaca, and they figured out it was him. He was like they say now. He was gay or homosexual or like that. Then the kid Porfirio clarified that it was him. He clarified that he had turned off the light, that he had cut it off because he was on a man-on-man relationship. And back then we called his attention to it in the files. That's what we called them, files, where we worked. And he said yes. And he said he was, like they say, gay. Rodriguez explained that everyone assumed that Porfirio had a love affair with another bracero, and to keep the anonymity of his lover, he basically cut out the lights. And that annoyed everyone because these barracks without that light were completely pitch black. And they could tell that the sound was coming from somewhere. But as Eloy explained, they couldn't pinpoint the noise. And I always wonder, could you not pinpoint it, or did you not want to pinpoint it? But many of the men were annoyed by the cutting out of the lights and that they'd have to repair it the next day. Porfirio's sexual preferences and his choice not to make a big deal about it says a lot about what was going on in the camp. To the majority of men like Porfirio didn't seem out of the ordinary. So it was quite common. The sexual economy changed also for women, queer men, transgender sex workers, and men who engaged in queer acts. Significantly, the telling of these stories became marginal in Bracero history. However, through oral history, we're able to get a fuller picture of the gendered and sexual negotiations that become visible and provide a more humanized picture of what was going on to Braceros, or what was going on with Braceros and how they experienced the world, while demonstrating the limits to their sexual freedoms. My very last case study for today is really about their pushback in the contemporary. Nearly half a century after the first Bracero program, or the first Braceros entered the US, Braceros and their families are reclaiming their historic contributions and are bringing attention to government corruption, abuse, and wage theft. In my last case study, I examined the Bracero justice movement, a movement to recuperate the back wages and focus on the largest Bracero organization, which is Bracero Program. I examined the ways in which historic narratives are deployed in order to critique both the Mexican and the American government and push both to do more for this aging population. Written into their contracts, 10% of their wages were supposed to be withheld and placed in a savings account. And the savings account was really an incentive to return to Mexico and reinvest in Mexico. Right away, many of the Braceros found that they could not recuperate these back wages. There was a lot of red tape, and the Mexican government really failed to return these back wages in a timely fashion, and for the majority at all. It's estimated that the amount that the Mexican government collected from these braceros is about $32 million. In the mid-1990s, several bracero organizations were created to recuperate these back wages. And there's one of them in a protest in front of the Mexican embassy, or the US embassy in 2004. What was interesting to me is that they deployed historical narratives and collective memory about the Bracero program to highlight Bracero marginalization. Narratives about family were once again used as a logic for joining the program. These narratives were juxtaposed with images and stories of alienation, toxic DDT sprayings, and unchecked labor exploitation, really in order to disrupt the logics that naturalize their bodies as beasts of burden. Although Bracero communities could not right the historical wrongs committed against Braceros in the past, they could work for a more just treatment of these men in the present. These communities defiantly transformed the image of a generation of single migratory men cast adrift in the North and forgotten in the South into a population of men who were attached to transnational and local communities fiercely committed to protecting their contemporary interests. As activist and ex-bracero Antonio Aragon explained, quote, "They are waiting for us to die, so this issue will be forgotten, so that we will be forgotten." Ex-bracero José Trinidad Eras launched strong critiques against the Mexican government, stating, "Do you know who had the good fortune of spending that money without suffering, without working over there, without being fumigated? Who sold us out? Our enemies sold us out, the Mexican government." The Bracero justice movement purposely builds historical narratives around the exploitative plight of braceros, leaving narratives about adventure, pleasure on the sidelines in order to shed light on the Mexican condition that led to the program and the American labor system unwilling to accept culpability for creating waves of Mexican migration. They use pictures like this on t-shirts and calendars, and they purposely use these pictures of alienation to really jolt people into having compassion for these folks' humanity, for supporting this movement. They also reproduce any official documents, such as their IDs, on posters for protests, on t-shirts. And my most sort of eye-opening moment, it wasn't just t-shirts, posters, calendars, cards, anything that they could carry to show these are historical images that show that we are not making this up. This is how we were treated. And so these documents and this historical narrative is really about bearing testimony to their oral history in a very material way. This book stands as a reflection, or my book, on public narratives about the Bracero program that emerged in overlapping moments. That is, the public narrative created by the National Museum of American History, by the Bracero Justice Movement, by the George W. Bush era administration that wanted to recreate a new Bracero program. The political discussions that lie at the core of public memory about the Bracero program reveal an inherent contradiction of a social system. As John Bodnard explains, public memory is produced from a political discussion that involves not so much specific economic or moral problems, but the fundamental issues about the entire existence of a society, its organization, structure of power, and the very meaning of its past and its present. Public memory around the Bracero program highlights the tension between America's desire for cheap labor and America's unwillingness to provide this workforce with labor rights, a pathway to citizenship or residency. Bracero memory reveals the contradictions around contemporary debates about immigration reform and point towards the new meanings of American civil rights. My goal was not to expand what we know about the program, but to reconfigure this knowledge to ask bigger questions about how the public remembers this, why the public remembers this, and how this memory is politically deployed and what is lost and what is gained in the process. This concludes my talk, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Loza, for that wonderful presentation. I just wanted to quickly say that I often assign this book, Defiant Braceros, in my courses, and it's such a great book to teach because it opens up new ways that students imagine these histories of immigration, labor, gender, and sexuality, how we can understand transnational families, social movements, historical memory, and also public history. So there's so many ways that this book contributes to the way we can understand the history making process. This book really is, for a multitude of reasons, really important for allowing us to reimagine braceros and immigration history. And after this presentation, I'm sure we can all certainly see why. So at this time, I want to open it up to the audience for questions and comments. So if you could use the raise hand function, I can go ahead and call on different people to ask questions and comments for Professor Loza. Let's see, I have Leo Sereni.
Yeah, hello, Professor. Yeah, I'm wondering if, so I'd imagine that if you have a situation where you're sending a whole lot of people to go to the United States, and you mentioned how they're in communities where they don't have the traditional family structure that's kind of overbearing and conservative, and they're open to more liberal experiences. And you couple that with the animosity I'd imagine they have towards the Mexican government because of the perception that I'm not getting what I fully deserve from this work. They're kind of withholding money from me. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the political ramifications in Mexico that this program would have, if the Braceros, if there was a voting bloc to form, if there were new interests that were involved, or if there was any shift in the political paradigm in Mexico because of this program.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that was surprising to me about how this history was written about, and I really loved, I delved into the scholarship and really loved it, but one of the things that I saw happening over and over is that folks put a lot of the onus of blame on the exploitation of braceros onto basically growers in the American government. And what I heard from braceros when I went and worked with them in Mexico is that they squarely also believe that the onus belonged on a Mexican government and basically an elite power structure that sold them out, that could not care about their well-being and did not care about their well-being. And so they basically vocalized that politically, they didn't have the power that they needed to protect their interests during the period of the Bracero program. And as elderly men, they didn't have access to this power as well. And so they mobilized with their families to say, we are important, this period was important, and the Mexican government owes us more. Interestingly enough, in the current period, the president of Mexico, AMLO, has been entertaining and advocating for a revival of the Bracero program. And this is again where we understand basically class, race in Mexico, in that there is an elite class of politicians that wants the Bracero program to come back because Mexico is highly reliant on these remittances sent by migrants and by H-2A guest workers, right? So they want these remittances. They believe that this is a way to address immigration reform, but none of these men and some women are willing to send their own family members to become the sacrificial lambs. So for me, I always ask this question, at least of politicians like AMLO, when you're ready to send your son to be a bracero for 5 to 10 years on repeated contracts, then you can advocate this for everyone else's child. And I don't believe that they will. I don't believe that they're interested. But over and over, the elite and the corrupt, basically Mexican government does not do very much to protect their interests abroad. Very limited. And so even the revival of a Bracero program, although we still have we've never not had Mexican guest workers, because when the Bracero program ended, the H-2A program was expanded, the H-2 program was expanded. And so we've always had braceros after the Bracero program has ended. And so for them to really ramp up the scale and the scope is a kind of tragic reminder that they don't have the political representation that wants to protect them.
Yeah, and I'd imagine it's almost like showing a disparity in like class if you have the political elite of the country who are willing, or they're seeing the economic benefits of it, but the nitty-gritty of the program itself, the human impact that has, it's just not something that's worth it for a lot of people who'd actually experience it. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for the answer and the presentation.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, we have another question from Carlos Arroyo Batista.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk, Professor Loza. I'm wondering about the issue you just mentioned about López Obrador wanting the Bracero program back. I think it's been a proposal since Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas's candidacy in 1988 to sort of include labor in the NAFTA negotiations. So even as I appreciate your framing of the program as a sold out, I'm wondering about how it's seen as benevolent in the present in the face of anti-immigration policy in the US. So even if it's like you mentioned, something very troubling, I'm wondering if it's, how could you explain regarding public memory, the force that it has on benevolence, on social mobility, particularly in the face of Trump's immigration policy?
Well, I think you bring up a really great point. Guest workers and a revival of the Bracero program has been brought over across many decades as a potential immigration solution. And the trouble I have here with this paradigm is that the solution for what they perceive of as labor shortage, and this is again perception, is because why I express perception is that these are very difficult, low-wage jobs that are not protected. And so basically, they've now have a calculus that Americans who are documented residents, citizens, would not want to take this job. And so they become Mexican jobs. The logics are that there is a racialized group that is exploited and primed for these jobs. We don't have to reform the jobs. We don't have to pay better. We don't have to protect people better. We just have to find the population that is suited to do this exploitative work. And so lots of folks always say, well, we can't pay $20 for an orange. But the reality is that in agriculture, we have a system that the USDA subsidizes agriculture. It is not straight capitalism, right? So we can actually afford to more highly subsidize basically the fruits and vegetables we eat versus the commodity crops we export, which are the most highly subsidized. And so the paradigm here that I'm always frustrated with is that the idea here is we are going to see how we can address immigration reform by trapping a population in a cycle of exploitative guest labor over and over, which means they come in, they do the labor, they leave, and they don't have to be incorporated into society. We don't need them to have full lives and full families here in the US. We don't need their children to go to school with our children. We can just pretend that we don't see them because they are erasable. They are erasable in all of the American imagination. All we need is their labor. And I think it reinforces this idea that you can have workers, we can have the labor without dealing with the workers. And when they become sick, because as they do in H-2A programs, we can deport them and terminate their contracts. When they demand more, we can deport them and terminate their contracts. When growers are not basically abiding by the terms of their contracts with housing or food or work conditions, what we will do is we will make sure to have the most docile class of workers. And if they speak up, we will deport them. And this is the formula that happens every so often when these H-2 workers, and even when Braceros spoke up and demanded rights, when they demanded labor rights and civil rights. And so my fear is that if this becomes an immigration solution, then we will have a perpetual class of exploitable workers that will never have entry into American society. And by design, they will always be erasable. And why? Why is that okay for Mexicans? Why? If it was basically a distinct racialized body, we would not be okay with that. There's a sense that Mexicans can do this. And we will also say it's by choice. They choose to come, they choose to seek out these H-2A contracts, or they choose to be braceros. And so we are not culpable of exploitation because it is their choice to be exploited. And I really dislike that. And all over and over, what I see is the problem is that there is no good guest worker program, none. Because while growers hold all the power, workers will never be able to speak back. And so essentially, we're not only erasing their labor rights, but we're also basically holding back on civil rights and human rights. And so when the Mexican government says this is a potential solution, I get frustrated because they will always step in, these workers, into an unequal exploitative power relationship. And as the basically labor organizer, activist, academic Ernesto Galarza said, it's like having the coyotes in charge of the hen house, which means that the hungry coyote will always try to eat the hen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments? Please use the raised hand function. Let's see. Questions, comments. Alexa de la Fuente, please.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for giving this presentation. I've admired your work in writing for a very long time. I did want to ask more on the race and ethnicity part of your presentation. If you found any reconnection to indigenous culture past that has fueled kind of like a resistance in these Bracero programs.
Definitely. I mean, there are many communities that experience the Bracero program in distinct ways. There are Purépecha communities in places like Janitzio that basically owned homeland, ancestral land, and were able to return after the Bracero program and did not stay in the US at the same sort of rates. Then you have other populations that tended to stay in places like Southern California after the Bracero program ended as undocumented workers at times, and sometimes found paths to residency. But by and large, I think what is interesting is that, you know, they are some of the most vocal critics about basically the exploitation, and they're also core participants in the Bracero justice movement, you know, from Zapotec, Purépecha, Mayan communities. And the Bracero justice movement has really kind of activated these networks and this historical memory, and really has indigenous communities talking about the impact of the Bracero program in their hometowns, in their, you know, communities. And so I think it's quite valuable and interesting. I also find it fascinating that, I mean, even during the Bracero program, I mean, there's a kind of double speak in Mexican culture, right? And in Mexican politics, in that during the Bracero program, indigeneity is celebrated. Indigeneity and in the indigenous past is celebrated as a pre-Columbian past, pre-conquest past, but indigenous peoples in the present, in that moment, were not celebrated. And so there's an interesting way in which, you know, the indigeneity functions on two levels. One is that, you know, artists like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and Siqueiros could say indigeneity is important, while politicians and locals still disparage indigenous communities. And so that, to me, is one of the most fascinating sort of levels of this program, that while indigeneity is seen as a core celebratory aspect of Mexican culture, it is in the parameters of the past, while indigenous people at that point could not celebrate it in those ways. And indigenous communities really found themselves exploited in particular industries that really focused on recruiting indigenous peoples. So there are several communities in Southern California that are, you know, predominantly made up of indigenous immigrants in, say, for instance, the Imperial Valley, that really sought them out for date palm work.
Thank you so much.
Okay, do we have any other questions and comments? You know, I have a question, Mireya. So much of your work is very, very public facing. You have this background as a curator at the National Museum of American History, but also as a participant in the development of the Bracero exhibit, right? I think you were involved in that process. You have this background as an oral historian, and you have training in public humanities. I'm curious to know, how did these braceros react to the Smithsonian exhibition, to the narrative that was displayed within this exhibition, but also to maybe some of the omissions and silences of that exhibition, because you clearly lay out, you know, a lot of this nuance in your book that may have not appeared in this public-facing exhibition.
I'm always fascinated by basically museum spaces, spaces that commemorate monuments, plaques. Like, I'm fascinated with how these things function in our society. And I think that, you know, the function of the exhibition was quite different than the function of the archive, than the function of my book. And so for a lot of these communities, I always wonder, had I been able to incorporate, say, for instance, the story of Porfirio and his sort of queer identity and his performance of queer identity, but also his encounters with his sexual encounters with other men. I wondered for many years how people would react to it in an exhibition. And I just sort of came to one conclusion, that for a lot, that the real problem isn't just the politics of commemoration and respectability. The real problem is the lack of representation. And so when you only have a certain number of moments of representation of these communities in public history or at the National Museum of American History, then all of the representations have to be uber respectable. It is when we kind of populate these sort of spaces, these public history spaces with communities, the stories of communities of color, and populate them a lot, that we can also tell the stories of folks like Porfirio, which might not fit neatly in a box, or people might not think that this is the story that they want, but it definitely is the story we need as a community. It's the story that really helps us complete a more complicated picture. It's a story that allows us to build queer histories for younger generations that need to see that it is not only their generation that is saying, I have a queer identity, but that this has a history, that queer folks in our community have a long, deep, rich history. And so I think my fundamental sort of critique is constantly around the number of limited representations we have in public history. And when it is that limited, then the audience expects all of them to be perfect and respectable, right? So our fathers have to be the greatest patriarchs, our grandfathers have to be the most perfect men, and we cannot talk about the sex workers that they encountered in the camps, or the drinking and the gambling. We can't talk about the reality, which is that not all men sent remittances piously. Some men did not. And some men opted to use their, salaries for pleasure, or for limited travel, or for limited something else, right? And so I think that's part of, the fundamental crux. And this is why I'm excited for things like a National Museum of Latinx History and Culture, because I think that that will be our opportunity to say, let's just populate all these hallowed halls with many stories, and not every story has to be the story that folks want to see, but it is the story that we all need to see.
Absolutely. And, like you, I'm just interested in the way these histories are presented to public audiences. And one more reason why we're also grateful for your book, because it gives us a more complicated narrative and story about the Braceros. Okay, we have time for maybe one more quick question. So I'll let Hannah Ponce ask the next question.
Hi, thank you. And thank you again for this presentation. It's been absolutely amazing. This is a history that in my time at Brown, I feel I have had a hard time encountering, and I've tried to base a lot of my different research projects, on the Bracero Program and also the Chicana movement. And again, just thank you for bringing this to Brown. It's been great. And I'm actually focusing my senior thesis upon the intersection between US guest worker programs like the Bracero Program and the rights and claims for recognition by Mexican laborers in the US today, which has been, a a big task. And something that I'm really interested in within this research is the intergroup dynamics between Mexican guest workers in the US and Mexican American laborers. And specifically, I think of, Cesar Chavez and his troubled legacy regarding the Chicano labor movement with his notable anti-immigrant sentiment. And I guess I'm just wondering how at all you've encountered this dynamic within your research and how it kind of shaped your telling of this history.
I think this is a great question. So one of the people who takes some of this on is my mentor, Matt Garcia, who basically was really keen on asking laborers and reminding us to ask laborers about organizing and about whether or not they had encounters with the UFW or with basically the labor movement before the UFW, which was really driven by several people, but one being Ernesto Galarza. And so, I mean, you do get a sense that Braceros did understand that the UFW was really not keen on having guest workers. And really the problem was that guest workers were not supposed to be used as strikebreakers, but they were often used as scabs and strikebreakers. Guest workers were used in ways that were never really supposed to be there, those uses were never supposed to be sanctioned by the state, by the federal government, but yet it happened. And I think that this is, again, one of the problems with all guest worker programs is that there are rules and regulations, but these growers and these local officials, they get slaps on the wrist when they break the rules, right? Whereas braceros, when they push back or break the rules, they get deportation. I think that is one of the central issues too that a lot of folks had with braceros entering the labor movement. Ernesto Galarza. So one of the case studies that I include in this presentation is really around their efforts to organize a transnational union, which is a chapter I write about, or I wrote. And so they try and they face all of these challenges in organizing. One is that Mexican Americans are not always cuddly, waiting for them with open arms. There's a lot of intra-ethnic tension. There are a lot of farm workers that are, American farm workers that see braceros as a fundamental problem, along with undocumented workers. And this really is a challenge for basically anyone trying to organize these guest workers. And how do you organize, again, a guest worker where not only are they facing all of this animosity with local Mexican American communities, but they're also just facing a lot of uneven power relations with growers. And so they're in a tough predicament throughout the program, especially those who want to speak up and say something and want to push back. Those who want to push back are the ones that have it the toughest. And even when they face deportation, they attempt to get recontracted, many organizers. And what happens? They get blacklisted. And so it is a challenge, to say the least. And I'm glad that you point out the complicated nature of Cesar Chavez's legacy, because I think that is, again, one of those moments where, because of the politics of respectability, we commemorate this person and really want to applaud all of his wonderful accomplishments. But this is, again, where we see the power of public history erasing those rough edges, right? And erasing that complexity often when we're talking about someone. And it really, I think, isn't because we really don't want to see this stuff. It's, again, a lack of representation of these leaders. And if we would be able to have more moments of naming schools and parks after people, then maybe Cesar Chavez wouldn't be the only person we'd commemorate. I mean, it isn't only Cesar, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you so much.
What a wonderful way to conclude the CSREA's summer reading series. Please, everyone, join me in giving Professor Loza a huge virtual round of applause. And thank you, Professor Loza, for being here with us today and sharing your important work and allowing us to engage with you and be in conversation with you. So thank you, everyone, for being here. This was quite a treat and such a pleasure, and take care.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming out. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Felicia.